Katharina Meyer et j'ai le plaisir de remplacer ni Estelle, Estelle est là aujourd'hui qui est notre coordinatrice du CELAT, ni Magali qui est la directrice. Donc moi je suis Katharina Meyer, professeure à l'école des médias et aussi membre régulière du CELAT. Et c'est le centre de recherche art, culture et société ici à l'UQAM. Mais en fait la maison mère, si on veut dire, a été créée en 1944, si je ne me détrompe pas, à l'Université de Laval, à Québec. Et puis on a un regroupement stratégique, donc il y a aussi l'Université du Québec à Chicoutimi qui en fait partie. Et puis c'est vraiment un centre de recherche transdisciplinaire. On a des historiens de l'art, historiennes, des chercheurs en médias, communication, sociologie, anthropologie, droit, archéologie. Bon, j'en ai certainement oublié. Donc je suis là pour vous souhaiter la bienvenue à Jackie Clarke qui va parler en premier. Je pense que lui qui va introduire ou quelqu'un d'autre qui va dire ça, c'est toi. Et puis aussi Stefan Moitra aujourd'hui. You want to say the same in English or it's fine?
No, it's fine.
Oh, good. So welcome and I excuse myself, I have to leave a bit before 2 o'clock because I'm lecturing. So just that you don't wonder that I'm like. Okay, so merci d'être là et puis à tous les enfants.
Juste un petit mot, je m'appelle Stefan, je suis un professeur d'histoire à Concordia, mais ici CELAT et la Chaire de recherche de Canada de patrimoine urbain avec Lucie pour la session sabbatique. Et c'est un grand plaisir d'introduire Jackie Clarke. Cette session, on a organisé plusieurs événements sur le changement urbain et la question du changement économique surtout. Jackie Clarke est une professeure de France, des études françaises à l'université Glasgow, à Glasgow. Puis peut-être je vais introduire Stefan Moitra en même temps. Stefan travaille pour le musée mineur d'Allemagne à Bochum, dans la vallée Ruhr en Allemagne. Puis il travaille beaucoup avec l'histoire orale surtout et les mémoires quotidiennes des travailleurs. Et Jackie, elle fait beaucoup de recherches sur les questions de genre dans le contexte de désindustrialisation en France.
Merci de cette invitation. Comme vous voyez, je vais parler anglais. Je m'excuse de ne pas parler français dans celui francophone, mais en fait, comme j'avais déjà un texte en anglais et puis ça s'est fait un peu à la dernière minute, je recycle un peu quelque chose que j'avais. Et puis, je me suis dit que ça serait en tout cas un public mixte. Et so I'm going to speak English, but si vous voulez poser une question en français, n'hésitez pas à poser une question. This paper really is a paper where I'm going to sort of revisit some material that I first collected actually between 2010 and 2014. So I'm really kind of revisiting something that I started a while ago. And I'm drawing here on the set of interviews that I did with men and women who worked at Moulinex, the French domestic appliance company. One of the reasons I was interested in working on Moulinex in the first place, there are people who call out and can't get back in bed.
Yeah.
So the reason I started working on Moulinex is partly because Moulinex is really a very emblematic company and brand in the French context. It's very much identified with the expansion of mass consumption in France after the Second World War in the 1950s through to the 1970s. With that long boom, known in France, of course, as the Grandes Glorieuses. But Moulinex also went bust finally in 2001 after a period of restructuring plans and offshoring. And four factories, a number of factories had already closed over the years. In fact, I can situate Moulinex for you on the map here. You can see it's mostly based in Normandy and the surrounding area. So this map is from the 1980s sometime. So it shows factories that had actually already gone, some of them, by the time the company went bust in 2001. And so the 4 remaining biggest factories then closed in 2001. In a shower of media attention in France, it's really attracted a lot of attention, and Moulinex at this point becomes emblematic of something else, not just les travailleurs, but the fate of the sort of long-serving Fordist worker in France. So part of the profile of the people who are employed at Moulinex is that a lot of them started work there before about the mid-1970s and stayed there, partly because there's not a lot of other jobs opening up in that kind of sector through the 80s and 90s. So you have this very long-serving staff, average age about 50, when the factory closes, average length of service about 26 years, I think. So, and certainly some of the people I've interviewed have worked there for considerably longer than that. So this really becomes a symbol of the end of a kind of social world that was constructed after the Second World War in France. So it has this very strong affective charge when Moulinex goes, both in terms of the sort of individual sense of loss as working lives come prematurely to an end, and also in sense of the sort of collective understandings of what's actually ending with the closure of Moulinex and what it represents. I started working, one of the origins of this paper is actually an event I was invited to at a Centre for the History of Emotions, and so I started trying to think about this kind of question, the sort of affective charge and the kind of emotional charge that is there in these kind of situations. The sociologist Tim Strangleman, known to several of us, has drawn on Raymond Williams' concept of structures of feeling to explore experiences of industrial change and the persistence of industrial cultures in what he terms de-industrial society in the UK. And Tim draws on interviews with railway workers, for example, noting how the narratives of older railwaymen were marked by what he terms a residual structure of feeling, an attachment to an occupational culture and a set of values handed down from the sort of male mentors who trained them through apprenticeship and so on. The sort of set of values that these men felt unable to pass on to the next younger generation, so there's this kind of discontinuity there. Now these are workers who had a very strong sense of themselves as skilled men, but one might anticipate that industrial structures of feeling play out rather differently among women workers who didn't have the same access to apprenticeships, to skilled trades, and the gendered forms of socialisation that shape the occupational identities of workers like railwaymen. So at Moulinex, there is a very significant population of women workers who were employed in semi-skilled jobs such as assembly work, while the skilled trades in the factories remained largely the preserve of men, even up until the time of closure. And this is something that really ran right through the life of the company. So in this paper, what I want to address is the feelings of both female and male workers by reflecting on their relationship to objects. And this comes from the fact that as I met Moulinex workers, as I was conducting interviews in the course of my research, they spoke about, showed me, and in some cases even gave me as gifts, objects that were linked to their working lives. These relationships to objects were gendered, reflecting the sexual division of labour in both the home and the factory. And indeed, male skilled workers attached significance to different kinds of objects from their female colleagues, and engaged in practices of collection and salvage that I didn't find amongst my female interviewees. And I'll talk a bit also about relationships to appliances, the products that people made. Now, making the case for the study of material culture, I think I've got a quote here that I can put up. I hadn't previously worked really on material culture, and when I did these interviews, I hadn't set out to work on material culture, except to the extent that I was interested in consumption and that kind of temps glorieux period and the acquisition of these goods in the home. But I hadn't gone in with questions about memory and material culture. So I'm really just kind of coming back to that question now. And so one of the people I've turned to in thinking about this is Laura Auslander, who has argued that even when relationships to objects are accessed through textual or oral sources, they can often communicate something that is beyond words. She talks about the ability of the artifact to be differently informative to text or oral sources. And she says, as you can see here, even the objects used in everyday, repetitive embodied activities such as eating or grooming are not simply functional, they're also modes of communication or memory cues, or expressions of the psyche, or extensions of the body, as well as sites of aesthetic investment involving pleasure, distress, or conscious indifference. Their makers and users understand them to have special attributes, not only because of their contact with the human body, but because they themselves mirror two crucial characteristics of human existence. They, like people who use them, are embodied. That embodiedness means that objects occupy space and can't be in two places at once, and they are mortal, although their lifespans may be much longer or shorter than the people using them. So I was interested in this take on what she thinks of as the biographical properties of objects and the way in which that is connected to the kind of emotional and symbolic significance of the object. And the connections that Auslander makes between embodied activities and objects, and the parallels that she draws between the life cycle of the person and the life cycle of the object, find a resonance, in fact, in an interview that I conducted with a woman called Ouvrière, who worked at Moulinex in Caen, just outside Caen, from 1965 to 2001. And one of the things we talked about in this interview was Jocelyne and her colleagues' relationship to the factory buildings, the old factory site where some buildings were still standing, and where an association of ex-Moulinex workers was based. And she talked to me about that place, and in particular the main gate where workers used to gather, and a building where the association was still based. And she said to me, in an expression that's really stuck with me, she said to me, c'est des pierres qui ont du vécu. So there's kind of lived experience kind of condensed into the fabric of these structures. And it's that kind of capacity of the object to the material thing to take on this kind of affective charge of what she calls le vécu, which I guess is lived experience in English, but it's kind of a nicer word in French. But it's that kind of a beyond words kind of a thing that she really gets at there, I think. So this led me to start thinking about some of the other people that I spoke to and the kinds of objects I encountered along the way as I met people. And one of those people is a man called Jean Froment, who started his career at Moulinex in machine tool maintenance. And he finished, he rose through the ranks, he finished as a technician in the company's research and development centre. And when I asked Jean how his work in the factory had evolved over the time that he'd worked there, he immediately spoke to me about the machines that he'd worked on. So he says, when I first arrived at Moulinex, I had a lathe. So he's come through a metalworking apprenticeship. I had a lathe, an old lathe that dated from before the war, I think. And then later, well, it was a new workshop, so afterwards a new lathe arrived that was very modern. It was an Elmo Sommois. Obviously that meant nothing to me, but I was nodding sagely, oh, an Elmo Sommois. With a foot brake. There was everything. And then as I got a promotion, and the needs of the factory were greater and greater, the machine parts were bigger, so they bought a big lathe. And at one point I had the biggest lathe in the group. So it's all those factories that you saw on the first thing. He had the biggest lathe, and it was 3 meters long. So we can see how Jean's professional sense of self is bound up here with the object and the tools that he used, and how it follows a kind of biographical trajectory that's kind of vested in the object. His narrative of career progression is a story told in objects, it's a story told in lathes. But it wasn't just in the interview that material culture was present when I met Jean. He and his wife, who'd also worked at Moulinex, showed great hospitality to me. They invited me for lunch, we had barbecue, they showed me around the house. And in their kitchen, they had on display an old moully food mill, which was the first object that the company that predated the brand name Moulinex was called Moulin Légumes, and they made this kind of moully thing, one of those things that you make kind of puree out of, that lots of people had in their houses, or their granny had in their houses. So they had the old original Moulin Légumes that they had acquired through friends and that sat on a shelf in their kitchen as a kind of heritage object, not directly linked to their personal experience, because they never made that object and it predated their time at the company, and it was made on a different site. So that was one kind of object I encountered, but interestingly, it wasn't the only one, because in the basement, where Jean had his workshop, sat an object of much more direct personal resonance. When Moulinex went bust, the factory machinery had been auctioned off for cash, and I've seen photographs of the auction where I can see several Moulinex workers that I know present at that auction. Jean had in fact bought one of the factory lathes in that auction. So in his basement sits this industrial lathe that of the kind, exactly the kind he had described to me in the interview. So he's got this whole kind of radio hobby as well, but sitting in his basement is this kind of industrial lathe where he continued to practice the craft that he'd learned as a young man through his apprenticeship. So I'm interested in a sense here in the distinction between the kind of Moulin Légumes type object that sits in the kitchen and the factory lathe, which are two kinds, I guess, of biographical object. One is a kind of classic collector's item that evokes the company heritage and functions as a kind of memory object, representing a distant past. But the other, it seems to me, is a rather different kind of thing, a more than memory object, or maybe a not yet memory object, a kind of continuity object that remains in use, and in this case expresses an ongoing attachment, I think, to an occupational identity and the practices associated with it. Now, in her discussion of biographical objects, Laura Auslander acknowledges a pioneering essay written in 1969 by the French theorist Violette Morin. And for Morin, a biographical object is a thing that is not just part of one's environment, but part of what she calls the intimate activity of the user. She gives the example of the carpenter's hammer, or a delivery man's van, and also the smoker's lighter. You can see this kind of dates to France in the 1960s. Objects that are, as she puts it, material embodiments of everydayness. She says, sa quotidienneté fait chose. Such objects are biographical in the sense that they evolve in symbiosis with the user, she argues, undergoing a kind of aging process as they acquire the imprint of repeated use. Now, in this analysis, the tools of one's labour can take on a particular significance, and it's clear from Morin's choice of examples, the carpenter's hammer, the delivery man's van, that the user that she has in mind here as having the capacity to imbue objects with this significance is a working man. Interestingly, from my point of view, Morin contrasts what she calls the biographical object that has this capacity and has been invested with this significance with what she calls, she uses this expression, l'objet protocolaire, this kind of formal object, a term that she associates primarily with household goods, which she sees primarily as commodities through their status as commodities. The archetypal formal object in her analysis is a domestic appliance. And like a number of intellectuals, French intellectuals of this period, Morin has this sort of interesting obsession where she abhors all things plastic, contrasting the properties of natural materials that take on the patina of age with the shiny plastic surfaces of appliances, which might deteriorate and be replaced, but she contends never bear the imprint of the user in the way that the carpenter's hammer does. She goes on to talk about the way in which, in her view, the fridge or the electric mixer don't individualise the spaces that they occupy in the way that biographical objects do. Because, she says, through them, all consumers commune in the same gestures. They are sort of devoid of vitality as objects. So there's this kind of critique of the commodification here that's, if you're familiar with kind of Barthes and Baudrillard and those other kind of French theorists of this period, you will recognise they hate plastic as well, especially Barthes. Bachelard has a whole thing about plastic. But the critique of commodification is infused here with a certain elitism, a fear of social homogenisation, and a romanticisation of manual labour, or male manual labour, right? A utilitarian object in the hands of a working man appears to take on an artisanal quality even when it's mass-produced. Think of the delivery man's van. What's the difference between a van and an electric mixer? Sorry to me, but in contrast, domestic appliances, she claims, don't conjure up the image of a life of labourers. This is a quote. They don't conjure up the image of a life of labourers and chores because they themselves, the appliances, perform the labour and do it much better. So caught in a kind of critical fascination with the myths of consumer society and the kind of phantasmagoria of the home with all mod cons, Morin actually erases women's domestic labour, denying it the ability to imbue appliances with biographical meaning. Now, not surprisingly, appliances feature quite strongly in the material culture of Moulinex. Both male and female workers expressed pride in the products that they made at Moulinex. Men, they spoke differently about them. Men talked very much about the kind of technical prowess and innovation involved in making the products. But pride in Moulinex appliances was also expressed through a kind of brand loyalty. The Moulinex workers were avid consumers of Moulinex products. One of the women I interviewed, Brigitte Pouchin, said to me, "We all bought Moulinex. We only bought Moulinex. I only have Moulinex appliances still at home." So what distinguished women's relationship to appliances then was that they spoke as users as well as producers and consumers in a way that their male colleagues didn't. For the women I interviewed, appliances had a history of repeated use, that embodied everydayness of the biographical object that Auslander and Morin talked about. And we see this in the fact that one of the most common things that people told me about their appliances was how old they were. This was a kind of recurring theme. So Josette Gosselin, for example, boasted that her microwave oven was still going strong after 28 years, and that she still had a working food processor that her husband had bought her as a present when she started work at Moulinex in 1969. Now, I mean, I'm not sure I would use a 28-year-old microwave, but you know, very cool. We were slightly worried that the microwaves were doing something damaging to me there, but this is a kind of constant theme of I've got this thing and it's X years old was something I heard quite. So these tales of longevity are also actually not unique to those who lost their jobs in the factory closures. I've also worked on a set of archived interviews in Alençon where some of the workers interviewed were older and had retired before the closures. But I think it's possible that that kind of duration, of the appliance takes on a different kind of significance, maybe for people who had lost their jobs. One of the women in the earlier Alençon interviews with Madame Poisson, she worked at Moulinex from 1960 to 1973. And she sings the praises of this 40-year-old food processor that she still used. And her friend, they're interviewed together, and you know, her friend sort of comments as she talks, waxes lyrical about this food processor, that it shows that Moulinex is not just any old rubbish. So there's this kind of pride in the idea of durability and solidity of the product. So there's something in these anecdotes that's about pride in having worked for a quality brand, or having made quality products. And the kind of durability stands in some sense for quality. But I think that there's also something else in a way, that knowing how long you'd use to been using an appliance is the product of that kind of everyday intimacy with the object, right? It's one that none of the men I interviewed had. They didn't live in proximity to that object in the same way. And that taking pleasure in counting the years is kind of talking about your appliance like a trusty old friend. So appliances in this sense could be just as much biographical objects as the real workers' tools. And indeed, the lives of the human and the object were arguably even more densely intertwined in this case, since the women who'd worked at Moulinex related to their appliances through these different layers of both as proud employees of the company, as makers of the appliances, but also as homemakers engaged in domestic labour. When Justine Berthaume spoke to me about her deep sense of loyalty to Moulinex and her refusal to countenance buying any other brand, she evoked this very a vague but clearly sort of effective sense of familiarity with Moulinex that gave her confidence. Sorry, that was Jean's. This is not actually Jean's lathe. It's a kind of it's a sort of stand-in for illustrative purposes, because since I wasn't working on material culture at the time, I'm kicking myself I didn't take a picture. So I'm sorry, I skipped over something there. So Justine, who spoke to me about this kind of sense that she couldn't possibly buy any other brand, she says, I wouldn't hear of buying anything other than Moulinex. Firstly, because with the Moulinex appliance, I know how to work it, whereas with any other brand, and she doesn't finish that sentence, she tails off. And it's always interesting when somebody sort of doesn't finish a sentence, there's some sort of unsayable, this thing that can't quite be articulated there. And I think this is where maybe the kind of objects sort of stand in for that, that thing that can't quite be articulated. In fact, Justine's brother had bought a supermarket brand microwave oven for their parents' house, she told me. And he taught her how to use it, despite her protestation here that there was some way in which this other microwave she'd never be able to work it. And she had ended up moving into her parents' house after they died, but she told me she'd put that new microwave oven in the basement, and she'd put the old kind of Moulinex one that she had in the kitchen. Like Madame Poisson. Madame Poisson had actually, this is the woman in the Annonce interviews who'd only worked at Moulinex for a shorter time and left in 1973. When she talks about this 40-year-old food processor that she still uses, one of the things she says is that she'd actually taken it apart and resoldered the switch to fix a loose connection. So this idea of your kind of intimacy with the object that you have as both the producer and the user, I think, is very much there in the kind of practice of kind of feeling confident to do that as well. And her 40-year-old food processor wasn't actually strong enough to mince meat anymore, she said, but it was great for carrots. It makes really finely grated carrot. So obviously the carotte râpée is kind of central important food item. So properly nice kind of carotte râpée, kind of fine, was what she liked about it. So these are stories about being at home with an object in more ways than one, of knowing how it feels, the distinctive texture of the food it produces. And I think it conveys something of the capacity of even these kind of plastic, mass-produced objects to embody this kind of vécu, this kind of lived connection with their owners. How many times? Okay, I'm going to shut up. In all the examples I've talked about, then the materiality of the objects in question is kind of crucial to the role that they perform here. These are objects that persist, even as the company that made them disappears. And in their materiality, they kind of transcend this biographical rupture of the career-ending moment of the factory closures. In this context, I think in view of the capacity of everyday objects to take on symbolically the characteristics of their users, it's difficult not to see this narrative of the appliance that's still going strong as a narrative about the resilience of the Moulinex workers themselves, right? And I think I talked about this. You know, I'm not calling these memory objects. I think they're in a sense kind of more than memory objects. And I'm thinking, I guess, partly about the way in which memory objects are sort of something kind of more distant and imply more of a rupture in some sense. I'm thinking about, when Noah talks about sites of memory, for example, he talks about that we have lieux de mémoire once there are no milieux de mémoire. And so there's this idea of a kind of some bigger sense of distance and rupture kind of has happened there, and that's how the kind of site of memory emerges. And I think these objects are not that. These are objects that in some sense, as I say, represent a continuity, or a different kind of continuity maybe, right? Or represent continuity in a different way, I don't know, something to think about. But in fact, in the campaign to save their jobs in 2001, Moulinex workers had adopted the slogan, les Moulinex ne sont pas des Kleenex. So Moulinex is not Kleenex. And so these two, they played on these two brand names to affirm that they could not just be cast aside like a paper tissue, right? It's a kind of anti-disposability metaphor. We are not disposable. And I think when we think about this narrative of durability and this kind of persistence of the object in that light, it kind of highlights a sense in which there's a sort of continuity here of that idea of non-disposability. The objects and the kind of workers' livelihoods are worth saving, and they continue to have that significance. Yeah, I think also that focusing on the sort of gendered nature of these objects in this way, in this case, kind of, I guess part of what I'm trying to do is also expand our analysis of industrial structures of feeling a little bit beyond the question of purely occupational identities, and sort of show how such feelings are shaped not just by histories of employment, but by a generational experience of coming of age in the long book, right? So the people I'm talking about were born mostly between the late 1940s and the mid-50s. They entered employment before the end of the boom, at a time when Moulinex was still expanding, having established itself as Europe's leading manufacturer of small appliances. And so this is a generation for whom rising living standards in the 1960s and 70s was a formative experience of their young lives, and particularly for the women who were engaged in domestic labour. So in that sense, I've been sort of toying with the idea of talking about not just an industrial structure of feeling, but a kind of Fordist structure of feeling, in the sense that that sort of embraces this kind of wider kind of industrial order of the kind of consumer society, or a Fordist society. I was going to have a postscript, but I don't know if I have time for my postscript. Do you want me to stop there? Mm-hmm. So my postscript was a bit that I had cut out of the paper. And then I decided this morning, in my jet-lagged waking hours, that maybe I would just throw it back in as a little coda. Because I realised that I probably would never have written this paper or started thinking about material culture if it wasn't for someone called Française and his magnetron. Now you might be wondering what a magnetron is. So Française is a guy that I met when I was doing interviews, and I didn't actually interview him, and I think that might be quite important, because I was looking for people who'd started at Moulinex. Again, because my focus was more on the kind of earlier period at that point, I was looking for people who started work at Moulinex before about 1975. And France had come much later, in the late 80s. He worked in the printing section, doing the sort of lettering on the appliances and Moulinex branding and so on. So I never interviewed him, but he was obviously quite keen. He was really keen to help me. And he invited me around to the house, and then he started giving me things. So he gave me documents and stuff, but he gave me a couple of pins, like Moulinex pins, a Moulinex sports bag, and the magnetron. And the first time I went he invited me around to the house, he started talking to me about the magnetron, and I had no idea what he was talking about. The magnetron is the component in a microwave that basically makes the microwaves work. Okay? And I didn't quite understand the significance of why he was talking to me about it. And he went looking for it and he couldn't find it, and it kind of bothered him that he couldn't find it. And then, as I was kind of regularly, around visiting this sort of association of workers, and he came to me one day and said, "I found the magnetron," and he showed it to me. I'm like, And then he said, no, you can keep it. I said, oh, okay, right, you know, I kept my magnetron. But I had no idea what to do with it, or what it meant, or what its significance was. And in retrospect, I think that the magnetron for him signifies, is tied to a story, again, about the value of Mulinex, and a kind of revalorizing something that has been denigrated in the public discourse after the factory closed. Because there was a lot of coverage that suggested that Mulinex kind of hadn't kept up with the latest technological developments, hadn't kept up with competition from Asia, which of course was absolutely signified by the microwave as a product where they had been kind of beaten in the Asian market by cheap Asian imports and so on. One of the things when microwave ovens started becoming one of the sort of big domestic appliances was that the Southeast Asian companies had managed to make the magnetron as the crucial component in a sort of mass-produced way where they could produce it much cheaper, and then companies like Mulinex were playing catch-up. But Mulinex managed to develop, they put a lot of work into this, and they managed to make a magnetron. And so this was his story of technological innovation. We were innovative, we did keep up, we made the magnetron, and so this was kind of important as a kind of corrective to the public, I suppose. But it's also, I think one of the reasons perhaps that France gave me so many things is perhaps also because I didn't interview him. And he wanted to tell me his story, and I should have just interviewed him, but at the time I was focused on my thing of I got this time here, and this is my, these are the people I want to talk to. And so I think what France was kind of trying to tell me with these gifts was about the way in which objects tell stories. So I guess I should dedicate the paper to France, because I probably wouldn't be here if he hadn't. If the magnetron hadn't been sitting in my study all this time telling me to tell its story, I probably wouldn't be here. So thank you.
All right. Well, first of all, really thank you a lot. Thanks a lot, Stephen, for the invitation. It came a bit as a surprise, but it's really very enjoyable for me to be here. And then I have to apologize that we have to do this in English and not in French. I mean, for Jackie, it would be probably more even natural to being in a francophone environment. But my French is really, I can follow it a bit, but I can't really speak it, so sorry for that. I'm talking a bit from a perspective which is a bit different to what Jackie was talking about. So in my wider project framework, I think material culture will also play a role and play a part, and I thought that was quite triggered some thoughts as well for me. But I'm going to talk more about narratives and different kinds of narratives related to different forms of memory. And I will focus on the Ruhr. When I mentioned my project, that project actually entails oral history interviews that we've been conducting in the Ruhr and in other coal fields in Western Germany over the last 4 or 5 years, 5 years. But I want to not just focus on the project itself, but contextualize it a bit. And probably situate it in the context of how memory of how industrial heritage gets represented in the Ruhr as a region, as a post-industrial region. And when we were talking yesterday, I think Stephen repeatedly said that the Ruhr is something like the world leader in industrial heritage, because it's so successful in remodeling this post-industrial region into something that is so shiny, and everywhere you have this, like in every tiny place you have an old coal mine, and there's a shaft here, and there's a museum there, and tourist trails and what have you. And that sometimes seems like very homogeneous and very clean in a way. And I, like picking up from our interviews and from the memories we were told about in our interviews, I want to rather see this kind of memory landscape as very fragmented. It's more like a fragmented tableau. And I want to, in my talk, give you maybe 3 or 4 examples of such fragments and relate them with each other in a way. And I called the talk "The End of German Coal Mining and the Politics of Memory." So I would say it's not all about politics in a kind of straight sense, but there's very often an underlying current of political impact related to different kinds of memories and to different kinds of memories in relation to industrial heritage, certainly in the Ruhr, but elsewhere as well, I think. And I want to start, here, I just skipped that one, I guess, but if you don't know where the Ruhr is, that's the Ruhr. And I said we also did some interviews in other places. We skipped, we left out the old East Germany. There was coal mining there as well, but it's a completely different kind of, it would be a comparative project, a different kind of project, and I think it's worthwhile doing it, but in our project we just kept it to the old western part of Germany. So this is the Ruhr region, 5 million people live there, and I think that's about it, what I'm going to say about it now. Where I really want to start is with these 2 images. And what you see here, actually the important one, or the more important one, is the one on the right side. And that's a kind of celebration. And it's a celebration last year, 21st December 2018. Oh no, it's 2 years already. Sorry. What you see here is a photo document of the officially last shift in the last German coal mine and the last, officially last lump of coal brought up by a miner, who you see in the middle at the center, and he presents it as a gift to the German federal president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. So it's a highly staged kind of environment, and you might ask, well, okay, it's a shrinking industry. Why do they actually give a damn? Why do they celebrate it in such a fashion? And you even see there's on the right side, next to Steinmeier, there's Jean-Claude Juncker, at the time the president of the EU Commission. Even he's there. So there are different kinds of political actors involved. On the left side, it's one of the high-ranking company executives, but he's at the same time, he's also the trade union representative on the executive board of that last remaining coal company. So you have different kinds of political actors here. So why do they put so much effort into celebrating this kind of farewell? They didn't want to just have it fade out silently, and they actually took a lot of money into their hands and funded and financed a whole range of cultural and even academic projects. Some very grassroots projects, some more academic, and now disclosure, even our project was financed by them and funded by them. That more or less left us in peace and didn't really interfere with our what we were doing and our actions. So I think, and this all culminated then in this staging of this presenting the last lump of coal mining. And in the left picture, then some months later, you see that lump of coal is being transferred from Bochum, from the Ruhr Valley, where the last coal mine was, to Berlin. And now this is actually here on this thing. It's really part, like a piece of art. It's now for forever. It will be part of the art collection or whatever in the official seat of the federal president of Germany, right? So, in my view, what's really actually behind these pictures is there's a grand narrative there, because the reason why they funded this is actually a bit self-celebratory. Do you say that? Yeah. In the sense that it's a celebration of a certain social policy. It's a celebration of an old approach of peacefully negotiating a conflict, and as opposed, for instance, to, I don't know, the miners' strike and manufacture, of handling an industrial crisis over 5 or 6 decades, actually. So the first outbreak of the coal crisis in Germany, the first pit closures appeared in 1958. And you had a slow fading out of this shrinking of the industry until 2018. It's literally 60 years. Of course, there were always struggles and conflicts, but they always found ways between workers, trade unions, state and employers to kind of sit at the table and negotiate terms how this could be successfully be led to an end. And the main, to sum that up, it's quite a complex history really, but to sum that up, it involved the state giving subsidies quite substantially over the years, and then the miners having to agree to early retirement schemes, which are very ambiguous in a way, because early retirement meant that usually you were sent into retirement around 50, sometimes 49 even, or in your early 50s. And that could be seen as an advantage, but it could also be seen as, well, you know, people don't know what they're going to do with their time. But it's this kind of peaceful negotiating and finding common solutions that is celebrated here, and that is like the grand narrative of these pictures and of the whole staging of this event of the last coal being produced. So that's like the first representation of memory that I want to talk about, the first kind of fragment. And I want to just juxtapose this in a way with some of our interviews that we made. Here you see some numbers, but I'm going to skip that as well. But you can see that in 1957 there were roughly 500,000 people only in the Ruhr employed in coal mining, and then the last coal mine then was 3,000 and something. So over a 60-year period, that was the development. So I want to give you maybe two groups of quotes. The first two come from trade unionists, and the second come from people who were kind of subject of these kinds of policies. And so I think here in this quote, it's pretty much a reflection and a mirroring of this kind of grand narrative. And here Norbert Formansky, who used to be a high-ranking trade unionist and also member of parliament for some time, he frames this very much as a success story of the trade unions. So I'm just going to read it out a bit. Shortly after I finished my apprenticeship, the first discussions about closures started, and after the establishment of Ruhrkohle, which was the unified company that kind of integrated all coal mines from the free market, if you will. After the establishment of Ruhrkohle after 1969, when the trade unions and co-determination played a key role, and that was the special new thing about this company, the whole thing was channeled more effectively. We still had to reduce employment numbers continually until 2018, But Adolf Schmidt, our union chief, coined that term. We won't succeed in bringing a complete halt of mine closures, but we have to succeed in letting not a single miner fall into the void. That is a bit tricky to translate because it's a very German mining term. It's an image denoting something like a rift underground, and you might fall into that. So they want to make sure that nobody is falling into that, right? But we have to succeed in letting no miner fall into the void. He coined that term. No miner was to fall into the void, was to be left behind. No one was to be forced to go to the labor office. And then he talks about the retirement schemes. So it's a bit of a, picking up on that success story. That can also be turned around to a tragic heroism, because it's always, they didn't like, obviously, they didn't really like participating in this kind of shrinking. But it was a kind of tragic necessity. And here, Willy Beermann, who, again, we've videotaped all these interviews, and it's interesting how they, this guy is 80, but he wants to come, he's a trade unionist, but he acted as an executive as well on the executive board of the company, and he wants to act like that and be seen like that, right? So, 12,000 employees had been reduced socially responsibly. That's a key semantic term, actually, social responsibility. I mention this because it was my responsibility and I was afflicted by it. And then during the meeting of the supervisory board, I had to report that out of the planned 12,000, we had reached 11,806. And even that was criticized. And I said, look at the public outcry for the Rheinhausen steel plant, where 5,005 people were laid off. 5,005 people was the average number for us in coal mining every year, and always socially responsible. And that has to be said, that was a great achievement of all the people involved. So there's an ambiguity there, how you can frame and interpret the kind of success story. It's a success, but it's also always a painful development. And then if you like get down to the lower ranks of people who are actually, this guy here was also a trade unionist, but he was more on the ground. He was a shop steward, Reinhard Adam. And he says, well, it was not social security. People were financially secured. And then in his narrative, it's a bit, the first bit is a bit humorous. It's a bit, he's joking. But then in the end, he gets more serious. Many wives said, when my husband stays at home, I'll divorce him. So what was the problem? The old man had been working at the colliery for decades. Now he's at home and he started to rationalize everything and tell his wife how thick she had to cut the cheese. How she was to do the shopping and so on. And many couldn't cope with the situation psychologically. I know many who turned to alcohol or to gambling or such like, because they had nothing to do with their time, or they just looked out of the window. And Jacob Trockman is repeating that in a way. The first 2 or 3 years were okay, you can do a lot. You can do what you have always delayed, to redecorate the house, do something here and there. But if I'm honest, it was total crap. Pension with 50 sounds great, but it was total crap. You have lots of time. I had my marching band, which gave me some comfort, but I guess you hear about it sometimes. Some get their pension with 50 or 49, and with 51 they're dead, because they had nothing to do anymore. You see it in the X- meetings. Everyone gets a little job on the side. That's our mentality. You have to be active. You can't just be on holiday. So there's also an image, a self-image of the identity of a male worker underground, what it means to be a miner. There's a work ethic there. It's our mentality, you have to do something. But then again, it's interesting that shortly after in the interview, the same guy, Jürgen Trockman, also switched his perspective around and recontextualized this kind of tragic stance on his own position. Everything changes, for better or worse, I don't know. In any case, this slow transformation was, in my opinion, better than the abrupt change, such as in England. Then everything would be dead here. There would be nothing new, rather everything would be in ruins, I guess. You've seen it too in America, in the various steel towns. whole cities have been destroyed. I think this socially coherent, responsible shrinking in the last 30, 40 years was a good thing. Whether it was financially okay, I don't know. But we have paid money for so much crap. I found it a just investment into the rural region. I think we have deserved it. I don't think everything would be still intact here had they acted otherwise. So it's very interesting how there's actually a transnational comparative perspective here. And how people are not just uneducated people with just with a very low horizon, and how they can situate themselves. But with this statement, we've deserved it. The subsidies, the investing into the region, a strong state. I want to reflect a bit more on current representations of the rural and about this industrial past. And as I said in the beginning, it's full of that kind of heritage sites and heritage places, and I think the last number that I have in mind is from 2017. 4.1 million people came from outside as tourists. 4 million people. To a region that is actually stereotypical in Germany as being, dirty, dark, and smoky, and all that. But this is just turning around, or has turned around. And just last week, actually, I popped into the newspaper shop in the train station where I live, and they had this Du Mont Bildatlas, which is like a traveler's journal, and was a special on the Ruhr. And it's it's all very clean. It says here industrial heritage in green, and you can watch the river Ruhr, and it's football, and there's my museum, the German Mine Museum, and all kinds of things. But it can also be, there's a different kind of discourse in representing the Ruhr, which looks more like this. So the kind of, the greening and the industrial heritage, that is how the Ruhr is marketed. But in national newspapers, there's a whole kind of, a wholly different discourse, which is much more about unemployment rates, poor people, the left behinds, and as you can see here, the tristesse. Or even, and I find that really funny, the Osten im Westen, so the East in the West. So there's actually a stereotypical image in Germany as a whole of the former GDR, the East, is the region that is really run down, and where we have problems with unemployment, poverty, and even right-wing radicals, and so on, and all these problems. So in the Ruhr, we have kind of like the New East, which is actually chronological quite silly, because, as I said, the transformation has already started in 1958, way earlier than the transformation in the East. But it's an interesting kind of framing of what the post-industrial region is and what the post-industrial situation is. And that ties in with a discourse on migration, which is very important. Also important for the next things that I'm going to refer to. Because it is, as a fact, the region is has one of the highest density of people with a migrant background, so-called. Nowadays, it's third or even fourth generation migrants, so you can really question this whole notion of people being migrants or not. But it's framed and reported as a problem of cultures not not showing willingness to integrate into the majority society, into the majority culture. There are reports on criminality, about the criminal foreigners, and this then notoriety about being criminals, and so on and so on. And this is kind of as an echo of the guest worker question, because it was always an issue whether the guest workers were actually, the migrant workers, were actually able to be integrated in German society, should they be able to stay, or should they actually be more or less sent back, and so on. And these are echoes of these old discussions. That plays a role for yet another fragment and representation of industrial heritage and of this mining heritage. And what the identity of an industrial or post-industrial region might be. And this guy is actually now a member of Parliament, of the European Parliament, elected as member of the European Parliament for this new right-wing party, the Alternative for Germany. He used to be a coal miner, he used to be a foreman underground, and he even used to be a shop steward and trade unionist, and a member of the Social Democrat Party in the city of Gelsenkirchen. And the city of Gelsenkirchen, again, is very much associated with images like, with images like this. Because there's a, there are some parts of the Ruhr region which are quite prosperous and which are successful also in getting like new thriving economies, but especially on the northern part of the region, there are severe problems with poverty, and Gelsenkirchen is one of those places. And he belonged there, he's from there. And you can see that, like, there's in this image, he's styling himself. There's no coal mining anymore, but he's running around literally disguised as a former miner with coal in his face. And even like in the language, there are always this, there's always referred to his identity as a miner. Our Kumpel is like a friend, but it's also a working mate from underground. It's actually deriving from coal mining contexts. Der Steiger kommt. So this is, the Steiger, that's really like a stereotypical and mythical legendary figure. That's actually a word for foreman. But, there's like, since the 19th century, it was very hierarchical and even militaristic working organization. This foreman, the Steiger, had a really strong position underground. And so Der Steiger kommt, that's actually again referring to a very famous song, and so on and so on. So you have all these references to the coal mining tradition of the Ruhr. But then it's about miners and industrial heritage being German. So there is implicitly here, there's a moment of exclusion as well. Who belongs to this mining heritage? Who belongs to this kind of working class identity? It is a white male identity that is being presented here. In contrast, there are other kind of political impacts, I would say, of framing and defining coal mining and other kinds of industrial heritage. And there are a number of grassroots initiatives, grassroots projects in the Ruhr that actually evolve from do-it-yourself projects of migrant workers, ex-migrant workers, who want to tell their own story. This one was particularly successful. It was 9 guys from Turkey who all came with the same trainery in the early 60s who came to Germany as mining apprentices and all made some kind of career. Actually, they all became Chaire. And so they are telling, they did a little publication and a traveling exhibition, which had a very good reception, telling their stories. And that was very much about being part and making themselves visible as migrant workers, as part of the grand narrative. They don't question the grand narrative as such, but they want to be part of it. They want to inscribe themselves into it. Yet implicitly, of course, this contrasts very much with this kind of alternative for Germany reading of it. So it's a matter of visibility. And then I come to my last example that I want to talk about. And that is here, they want to be visible in the grand narrative. There's also part of the whole tableau, fragmented tableau, something that is as yet really not seen at all, and that is more like a toxic heritage. And that this example that I'm going to talk about now is not really related to coal mining as such, because the guy who was one of the victims, if I might say so, was actually a steelworker, a Turkish steelworker in the city of Duisburg. And this is a project called, well, Initiative Duisburg, 26 August 1984, which is the date when there was an arson attack on a house where mainly migrant people were living, migrant families were living. And it's a family by the name of Satye. And 7 people died, most of them children, actually. And so the 80s, the mid-80s, were like the height of crisis discussions in the Ruhr. In Duisburg, I think the last coal mine had already closed down shortly before that. But Duisburg was also very prominent for its steel industry. So Essen and Duisburg and a bit of Dortmund, they all had steel industry. And they were also threatened by closure. And there were reports about new right-wing radicalism, but in that story, that was completely blanked out. So there was contemporary reporting in the newspapers that didn't even mention the name of the family that was afflicted. So now, in the context of a new race, if it's new, I don't know, but let's call it a new racism in Germany, a new upsurge of right-wing populism. There's also kind of emergence of new anti-racist movements and activities. And so this is actually a project in Duisburg with family members of the victims who now want to kind of redress, if it can be redressed, but this whole story, and who want to discuss it more openly and relate it to the history of racism and the history of racist attacks in Germany over the last 20, 30 years, and then relate this also to the current situation in Germany. So again, I think they themselves, I only know them very briefly, I think they themselves wouldn't probably in the first place connect themselves and situate themselves in an industrial heritage or industrial history context. But I think you can, if you want to look at that angle, also see it from there. And, right, so summing this up, you have these kinds of very different kinds of narratives and different kinds of representation. And as I said, I think that this too homogeneous picture of successful transformation of the Ruhr from industry to post-industry, and to this, forerunner of industrial heritage and successful industrial heritage is a bit too one-dimensional maybe. And I think if you scratch at its surface, you very quickly get these kinds of different representations. And I think, this is in a way very much a work in progress. I don't know really how to, what's my take on this exactly, whether there's a new narrative, and I don't know if that's really even possible, but I think it's interesting to kind of juxtapose and contrast the different levels and different meanings. But I think one of the things I find important is, firstly, the celebration of that I called the grand narrative. There's the celebration of an old welfare state. These guys here presenting this lump of coal, they are by no means left-wing radicals. But I think what's in the grand narrative is this call for a strong state, in a way, as opposed to market liberalism. And it's a call, an implicit call to take this experience of crisis management into the future. And I think that's, maybe I'm overstretching it actually, right? But I think that is one probably important result looking at that. But then you can see with the interviews that collective memory is actually quite fragmented as well, and not really collective maybe. So we can also question this notion of collectiveness. And then you have a whole new political sphere where industrial heritage or industrial past, whatever heritage is then, really matters and constantly gets, redebated and reframed. And there's a whole conflict about that and what it really means today. I think that's it. Thanks.